Our third focus is on research to understand the landscape for creative economy and technology across the continent. The insight generated supports evidence-based decision-making for the practice, investors, our portfolio companies, and the ecosystem at large. Currently, we are implementing the African Cities Cultural Vibrancy Index, which is funded by Africa No Filter and the British Council, and is supported by the World Cities Cultural Forum and the Arab Fund for Arts and Culture. The index will measure the level of support for storytellers and the creative economy. We are at the inception stages of data collection. A link will be shared in the chat, and we request after these discussions that you take time to help us fill out the survey about organization. Completing the survey will take no more than 10 minutes. Finally, we focus on investment through CcHUB Syndicate, where we invest in startups from ideation to scale-up stage with check sizes ranging from $5,000 to $250,000. The current Creative 1.0 accelerator will culminate into an opportunity to pitch for investment. The creative economy practice areas of focus adapts the definition of creative industries for the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, which makes a distinction between upstream activities such as traditional cultural activities, performing arts, visual arts, film and music, and downstream activities much closer to the market such as advertising, publishing, or media activities. So today we are here to discuss barriers and opportunities for trade and investment, and we have a very exciting panel comprising of Natasha Kimani, who is a research and media program lead at Africa No Filter. Natasha is responsible for overseeing research development and media grant making across the continent. Then we have Marie Lora Mungai, founder and CEO of Restless Global. Marie Lora Mungai is an investor, strategic consultant, and entrepreneur specializing in African creative industries and sports business, with a 17-year experience spanning 26 countries on the continent. And finally, we have Ojoma Ochai, managing partner, the creative economy practice. Her 15 years plus experience of spans international cultural relations and leading creative and digital economy projects. She is the current chair of the ATCG Group Network, sits on the board of BTrust, an organization set up by Jay-Z and Jack Dorsey to support Bitcoin development in Africa and other locations. And she's a member of the UNESCO expert panel. We are excited to have you on the panel today and look forward to a great discussion. Welcome all. Without further delay, I will request that you allow me to jump straight into the questions. So the first question will be one of the most recent popular topics for discussion in the continent, which is the Africa Free Trade Agreement. I will request Ojoma to take us through the first question. Ojoma, the AFCTA is projected to boost intra-African trade by 52% by 2022. What will be the impact of intra-African trade on investments in the creative economy?
Thanks for the question, Naomi, and hello, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us this morning. I guess I should start with what is the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement? I imagine that many people, maybe most people know what it is, but quite simply, the AFCFTA is an agreement that has been entered into that has been signed by 54 of the 55 member countries of the African Union. So that's every country except Eritrea. And I think it has been ratified by something like 41 countries. It went into effect on the 1st of January of 2021, although key aspects of the negotiation are still ongoing, so it's not fully functional. And essentially what it is, it's an agreement that makes Africa into a single market. And in practice, what that means is that goods that are manufactured or services that are originating from anywhere in Africa will be treated everywhere on the continent as a domestic good. And the implication of that is that the tariffs that you would normally pay on imports will then be reduced. And the target is that for 90% of trade on the continent, there will be no tariff, which means, like when you're importing a car, for example. In many of our countries, something like 20 or 30% of the cost is import tariffs that you have to pay. And so with the agreement coming into full force, most goods made on the continent being shipped or being sold to other parts of the continent will not have to pay that tariff. That's what it is in its simplest terms. But to your question, Naomi, what does this mean for investments in the creative economy? And I thought I might look at this from 3 angles. One, when you think about it, investments are typically about one of 2 things. Investments are about profit or they're about impact. And so when somebody is giving you money to develop a product or a service or a company, they're either wanting to get money back and make money off it, or they want you to make some kind of impact. And so how does this correlate to us having a single African market? To my mind, in theory at least, and I'll talk about why I say in theory at least, if we have bigger markets as Africans. So if you're based in Botswana, for example, suddenly with the free trade agreement, you're no longer restricted, as it were, to thinking about Botswana as your only market. You're suddenly thinking about the continent as a domestic market for you. So the implication of that is that the potential for profit and the potential for impact is massively increased in theory. And so it means that if investment is positively correlated to the level of profit and the level of impact, it means that with potential greater profit and impact, then there will be potential greater investment. So I think that one of the implications of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is that we will see more investment into creative economy companies and businesses. I keep stressing in theory, and I'll talk about that, because at the end of the day, it's all down to the quality of implementation and the quality of the context for that implementation. So that's my first point, increased investment. I think something else that the Continental Free Trade Agreement can also potentially do for the creative industries is increase collaboration. I know that collaboration is critical in many sectors, but I think the creative sectors is one of the places where it is most critical, because when you think about it, whatever type of creative product or service you're delivering requires often diverse sets of skills to make a project work. So if you're thinking about a film, there's such a diverse range of talent. You're talking about artistic talent, management talent, technical talent, marketing, all of those things. And so collaboration is important. And in many instances, that skill and that capacity that is required is not always necessarily resident in any one country. Obviously, there's exceptions, but because many of our sectors are so nascent, there's so much potential for us to be working more across the continent. And so for me, potentially what the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement with related policies can do, and I'll talk about one of those examples of related policies in a second, but what they can potentially do is foster more intra-Africa collaboration. And what do I mean? So to collaborate at its most basic, you have to have met people, right? You have to know them. You can't collaborate with who you don't know, right? And historically, the way that collaboration is triggered is by meeting people. And we know if you've tried to travel anywhere across the continent, it is expensive, it is difficult, it is just a mess often. And so there's something called the Single African Air Transport Market, which was launched in 2018. So this is not part of the Continental Free Trade Agreement, but is related in that it aims to liberalize the sort of air transport system across Africa to increase the frequency of regional flights, reduce the cost of regional flights. So I think if travel is made easier, it means it's easier for us to meet each other, it's easier to collaborate. And so that's one potential benefit, is that there will be increased collaboration. And then I think finally, actually still on that point, one of the protocols of the agreement is the protocol on the free movement of persons across the continent, which is aiming to introduce visa-free travel across Africa. That's probably still a long way off, but if that happened, combined with the air transport agreement, that could potentially be a game changer for how we collaborate. And then the third and final point I'll make related to this is there's something called the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, PAPS. Essentially, what PAPS is trying to do is create a single financial market structure for the continent. Because when you think about what are the barriers to intra-Africa trade at the moment, that's what I was talking about. Travel, there's logistics, but there's also payments, right? If you're a graphic designer in Tanzania and you're trying to offer services to a company in Lagos, how do you get paid? It's really difficult and expensive. So what PAPS is trying to do is to unify the 55 or 54 different financial regulatory and contexts on the continent so that you can pay in Kenyan shillings to somebody collecting Nigerian naira in Nigeria without having to go through the US, first of all, the FX issues, without having to convert it to US, but also makes it instantaneous and quicker. Across all of this, I think the opportunity that technology provides for us to collaborate, trade more as Africans is massive in terms of, against the backdrop of the agreement, but also in terms of investment. So in a nutshell, I think what AfCFTA can do for the creative economy is increase investment, increase collaboration, and increase growth. I did say I would talk about, in theory, why I say in theory, we have to be able to implement certain fundamental enabling environment things for that to happen, like protection for intellectual property, like all of the logistics stuff I've just talked about. And we need to understand how we can use technology to leverage that. So that's a rather long answer to your question, Naomi, but back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Ojoma. We shall now move to still a question related to the AfCFTA, and this will be a panel question. And maybe we can take it with Natasha, Marie, and then back to you, Ojoma. So one of the objectives of the AfCFTA is to enhance the competitiveness of the economies of state parties within the continent and the global market. In what ways will this boost trade and investment in the creative economy? Natasha?
I think let me begin by first taking us a step back, because in public policy, we have a statement that funding follows function. So you have function. And for you to be able to know whether or not a government actually backs what it says when it says it believes in implementing a particular thing, is the funding behind that particular project. Is there money behind it? Is there goodwill behind it? You may have as many policies and programs as you want, but the problem lies in implementation. And one of the things you need in implementation is political will and finances. And then we need to ask ourselves, we're talking about a continental agreement, but what about the national agreements and policies in place? Because you cannot operate on a regional scale if you're not succeeding on a national scale. And I want us to take a step back and also look at how we think about the creative economy on the continent. And I just want to take you back to a report we carried out at African Oak Filter on business in Africa. And only 1% of the news around business in Africa, both internationally and regionally and nationally, talks about the creative economy from terms of actually ensuring that we will enhance the economy. So therein also lies a problem. We don't think that that creativity, innovation and creativity can actually enhance the economy, can actually better the lives of Africans. So we may have many conversations about it, but we need to go back to the drawing board. What are the existing narratives about the creative economy on the continent? And how can we shift public policy thinkers, implementers, and the ecosystem at large from the rejection to the adoption scale for us to begin to actually believe that this is putting money into the pockets of Africans. We have the second largest film industry globally, Nollywood. When you think about Afrobeats and piano, I was in London last week. Every single club I was in was playing Afrobeats. That tells you something. We need to pay attention to this. So before we start thinking about the AfCFTA, which is also a problem because only based on our data, only 0.3% of Africans know what the agreement is about. That therein is problematic to begin with. So there's this whole agreement that's meant to transform the continent and transform our lives, but we don't know what it entails. And I love the way Ojoma explained the agreement because it was so simple, it was so basic. And I hope that public policymakers are actually listening to these conversations, because before we begin touting that this agreement is going to change the lives of Africans, we first need to ensure that we're involving them in the process of change, that we're actually putting money where we say we're going to be putting it. And most importantly, we're involving the voices that matter. I will come back to the public policy challenge when it comes to creativity and innovation, but those are my initial thoughts.
Thank you, Natasha. We'll move on to Marie's contribution.
Yes, thanks, Naomi, and thanks, Natasha and Ojoma, for taking on this question. So first of all, everyone, good morning. I'm very happy to be here. So I think I want to bring a slightly different point of view. So because I think both Ojoma and Natasha made the case very well on why that trade agreement is important from a policy perspective and in terms of putting down some building blocks that are currently missing, or at least overcoming some hurdles. However, I'm going to bring maybe the point of view of the private investor, right? So, of course, a government or you know, a regional government in that case can have a huge impact on the growth of a specific industry. I'm originally from France, so that is the country where I think the government is the most involved in supporting culture and creative industries. So I have seen all my life growing up there that for sure it can have a big impact. So that's something that should happen. However, you don't know how long it will take, like both of my co-panelists have said, and we can't really wait until this happens. Who knows? And it's so confusing, and so many people have to agree on the same things, and it might take forever. So it's a wonderful thing that we've gotten so far, but in the meantime, we'll have to get going, right? So when it comes to the private sector, so if you want entrepreneurs and companies to thrive in the creative industries in Africa, you have to direct funding to them and you have to direct training to them. But for this to happen, people who have the funding or who have the skills and the ability to train need to understand why it's a viable option. In the past 5 or 6 years, through my advisory practice, I focused a lot on the topic of financing the creative industries in Africa, because I think everybody here knows and is aware that this is currently not happening. Traditional investors are not looking, so I'm thinking of banks, for example, VC firms. They're not looking at the creative industries as a viable sector. They do not understand how it works. They get very scared. They think it's very esoteric. It's a whole bunch of artists, you know, coming together, doing some small project, and so they don't touch it. We have the issue of, you know, intellectual property, which is very difficult to establish and maintain and protect in Africa. In other markets, such as the US, where it's extremely strong, you can use your intellectual property as a collateral. They have enough data to determine how much it's worth. And so that's a very big component of why the creative industries in the US are thriving as a business. Again, France, a model of government-supported industries, US model of fully commercial industry. So we have that issue of the intellectual property framework. There's actually, the funny thing is that there are legal frameworks that are pretty okay, but again, implementation is super hard, and piracy is really occurs. So then how do we do that? So what I've been doing on a personal level all these years is trying to do a lot of thought leadership and a lot of awareness building on, yes, the creative industries in Africa can be an investable sector. However, not all of it, and not randomly, you know, just like in any sector, some businesses, some business models, some regions are more conducive to investment, Nigeria being the main one, obviously, because of the very, very large population and I must say, the love of Nigerians for their own products, which is, you know, prerequisites to having an actual commercial industry around the creative industries. So trying to explain to investors, it's possible, come here, and this is how you can do it. And drilling down to really, you know, the type of companies that are worth being invested in and how. So I think that this is what we can do, all of us, in the meantime, as we wait for this framework to happen and to become concrete, is how do we get the investors to understand more about the creative industries, how they work and what's investable. And also on the other side, and I think that's really what the CcHUB is doing very well, is trying to prepare the entrepreneurs from the sector to receive investment. Because that's the other end that's missing, is that in general, the companies are not investment ready. And they're not ready to receive any kind of investment. So that's also something that we can do, all of us, is to get ready, so that at some point the two can merge. So as it relates to intra-African collaboration, I think that and we can talk about this later, there are things already today that are happening that are leading more to that. I'll just mention a few trends that I'm excited in as an investor. Is the mass digitalization of a lot of creative goods that has happened also that was accelerated during the pandemic. So we were all, during all the lockdowns, we all found ourselves in front of our computers, eager for entertainment, eager to learn, eager to see new things, and the creatives have responded. So this has happened around the world. But what the big opportunity for Africa is that all of a sudden creatives in Africa were able to access global audiences, not just audiences from their own countries or region, but the barriers really fell quite a bit. So we've mentioned Afrobeats, but there's lots of other trends that have gotten a much wider audience all of a sudden. I can give the example, for example, of AY, the comedian in Nigeria, Ojoma Ochai, who used to do his annual concert physically in Nigeria. All of a sudden during the pandemic, he has to do it on IG Live, and he goes from maybe 10, 20,000 people in the room to millions. So that's really what has happened during the pandemic. There's new means of monetizing these audiences that have been rolled out on the global platforms, but also through the acceleration of fintech solutions. So Ojoma, you were talking of PAPS. Let's hope it happens fast. But the private sector has not waited for this. There's been the explosion of fintech. It's becoming easier to get paid from one country to the next. And I also want to mention this other trend, which is the adoption of cryptocurrencies on the continent, which is really being used in Africa, not as a means to speculate, but mainly as a means to encourage peer-to-peer transactions, meaning from one individual to the next without a bank in the middle. And this is enabling creatives from across to get paid from, by anyone around the world. And so that's the kind of things really, if we look at, okay, so the free trade agreement is in the works, but in the meantime, the same movement is happening privately, with people not waiting for it to happen, but just making it happen with tools that they have now.
And thank you, Marie. Thank you, Natasha. Thank you, Ojoma, for your responses. We'll now be shifting gears to policy. Natasha, you have sat on several boards and have been involved in public policy and are now at Africa No Filter, which is largely a creative outfit. With regards to your experience in these different sectors, at what points does policy and the creative economy cross, and what is the effect of this on funding in the sector?
Thanks, Naomi. I think, once again, the issue of policy underlines everything that we do. Public policy is at the heart of everything. It creates an enabling environment. It creates and provides a platform for Africans to do business, to engage, and to create. But the main challenge we face on the African continent, and I don't want to generalize because there are nuances and complexities to each country, is that oftentimes when African governments think about, let me speak about my government, the Kenyan government, and when the Kenyan government thinks about creating an enabling environment, it thinks about putting everything under government protection, in the sense that then if we want to have a creative industry, it has to be government-led. And that's not creating an enabling environment. Actually, that's policing and gatekeeping a space that should be enabled for Africans to thrive without the involvement of government. The only place where government should be involved is to ensure that the licenses and the spaces for Africans to engage are actually liberal enough for them to be able to afford to survive, to create, to have businesses, to thrive. I think that is where government policy should actually stop. how are we ensuring that Africans on the continent, and again, I would like to speak about Kenyans, how can we ensure that Kenyans are thriving, not by creating government arms and government departments to sort of keep how work is being done, but to ensure that the policies in place are giving space for Africans to think outside the box. That's one. Two, I want us to take us back historically at the challenge of around the challenge of the creative business. Again, apologies for the noise. If it's pissing me off, I can't imagine what it's doing to the listeners on the other end. So I'm very sorry for that. The challenge is historically, the creative industry was used as a form of revolution politically. And that has generally created a sense of fear for politicians. That once we enable this particular environment, and if you think through a lot of African countries, be it song, be it film, be it poetry, a lot of it is resistance historically. So creativity and innovation was used to sort of express ourselves. And there was a fear in that creativity can be used to cause a revolution and revolt. And I would like to beseech governments by the mercies of God for us to shift away from that harmful thinking that creativity can be harmful to the political space. I want to challenge us and say, why don't you give Africans a space to create without keeping them with the fear that they could use these particular platforms to harm the political or to create a political divide. And so I think first we need to address that political historical trauma. And again, I want to use the case of Kenya. If you think about songs of the Koinana, Inchi ya Kitu Kidogo, that's an example. The songs, just even books by Wole Soyinka, a lot of them are about resistance, about coming through. And that has sort of created a sense of fear and then overregulation of these particular sectors. So you find instead of giving these sectors room to thrive, we actually go out of our ways to kill them. And then creatives have to find different ways to create and to grow. And then that there is a challenge where we are using policy to actually harm this sector instead of giving young Africans room to grow and room to thrive. And it is historically rooted in the fear that this could actually harm the political divide and the political community that is exists. So just to give some thoughts on that, but also taking a step back on the importance of uniform policy, not just nationally, but regionally. We have regional blocks on the continent. And again, our data shows us that the creative economy is least on their agenda. And that is very worrying. When we think of trade, when we think of business, we never think of the creative economy as a business, as a tool of trade, as a true tool of uniting Africans. And we need to begin to ask ourselves why. How can we then flip that to ensure that this thing that a lot of young Africans are moving towards is a thing we can focus our attention and skill on. And a lot of the conversation on the continent is around agriculture. And while that is great, we are still having to force young Africans to move towards farming. We don't have to force them to be creative and innovative. Then why then don't we take that opportunity to ensure that we are creating an environment and policies that make young Africans thrive? So I think it's also a shift in attitude, a shift in thinking about what is important and what is a priority for governments and regions as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha, for that very great and exhaustive response. Indeed, we can see a luta continua. And still back at you, Natasha, there's a perception, especially in Africa, about the creative economy and its players. And this can be extrapolated to even the intake numbers of creative courses in higher education, the pipeline of creative graduates to gainful employment in these fields, and so much more. How do these perceptions affect funding of the creative economy or lack thereof?
Again, Naomi, it boils down to narrative. There's a narrative that most people who get into the creative industry are failures when it comes to the academic sector. So it's sort of the thing you give people who didn't thrive when it comes to mathematics, science, and technology. It's a thing you do when you don't get into the courses that matter. So you can imagine telling a parent that instead of becoming a doctor, you want to become a painter, that conversation doesn't go down well. In fact, perhaps a lot of people who've chosen that route are perhaps in therapy as we speak, because they're dealing with the trauma of having shared that particular piece of information with their parents. And I'll give a very practical example. My background is constitutional law. I spent a majority of my career working in government and drafting policies. But when I shifted to go into the arts and culture space and media, it took family 2 years to be able to articulate what I do for a living. So for the first few months, they were telling everyone I was on a sabbatical, because who in the hell leaves a space that is thriving, such as public policy and law, and gets into arts and culture? It doesn't make sense. And therein lies a problem. We begin thinking of arts and culture as a thing that is less than. So we don't fund it the way we should. In fact, a lot of ministries in Africa have arts and culture, gender, and sports into one ministry. That just shows you the importance that is given to the sector of arts and the creative economy. Everything is lumped into one because you're not that important to stand as a department on its own. We don't need to allocate a lot of resources for you to thrive. But most importantly, if you just look at in the general scheme of things, when we are reallocating, and even for funders like myself, we have very few organizations that are dedicating resources to the creative economy. We don't think that there's a connection, for example, between the narrative that we're telling around climate change and the creative industry. Yet, the news that we read, the stories that we hear are all based off of the creative industry and economy. And the narratives we begin telling ourselves about a particular thing are from creatives. When we begin to think that way, that everything is narrative based, then we put our resources into shifting existing narratives about what is important, the need to thrive and invest in the creative economy. So there's a negative perception about people in the arts to begin with. That leads to underfunding. That leads to overtraining. And this is another challenge we face as funders, where we are constantly training creatives. And I dare say boldly that there's no one as trained and capacity built as Africans. Africans don't need capacity building, they need funding. They need money to carry out their projects. So what do you do with an industry of people who have training but nothing to do after the training? Where do they go next? And that's what we need to begin thinking. What is the next step? They have been trained. Do they have opportunities to implement the training that they have learned? Those are questions we need to start thinking about. The tech industry is thriving for many reasons. One, there's not only training, but there's funding and there's opportunities. Why isn't there the same funding and opportunities for the creative industry? I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Natasha. Some very provocative thoughts there. Thank you. I'll take on the panel, and for this question, and just for the sake of managing time, I will ask Marie and Ojoma to address it in that order. So culture is closely associated with the creative economy. The culture of certain peoples and culture largely affect the output of the creative economy. In what ways has culture affected funding in the Africa creative economy, if at all? Over to you, Marie.
Yes, I think I'll see two answers to that. The first one is, again, I was talking about how do you build businesses in that sector that are actually fundable and actually can grow and scale. So we were talking again about considering the entire continent as the domestic market. Yeah, thank you. I mean, I have Lisbon and Chugo, but my connection is not so great. So, all right. So if you look at, okay, you're a creative entrepreneur and you are trying to build a business and you're considering the continent as your domestic market, potentially. One of the things that we have not touched on, but that speaks to what you said, Ojoma, earlier in terms of being in theory, is that we're all aware here there's 54 countries and there's thousands of cultures inside these countries and languages and traditions, and it is not a homogeneous market at all. So let's not fool ourselves, first of all, that even if the African Free Trade Agreement was in place, it would be easy. It's not. So a lot of us over the past 15, 20 years, we've been trying to create content, to build companies that go wider than one single country. But we have to realize that the creative sector touches with culture, it does not translate that easily. So for example, if you look at the audiovisual sector, you deal directly with culture because you film a movie, it's in a specific language, it tells a story from a specific cultural point of view, people react to situations in different ways, there's local traditions that might not be understood outside, and that makes a piece of content not that easy to sell outside. First of all, outside within the continent, and then outside of the continent. So that's one of the challenges of the creative industries, is how can you transcend the original culture you're in to go global? So lots of people are trying to do that. The Netflix and Amazons that are on the continent are trying to come up with the right formula for content to be feel both local and global. It's the whole glocal term. But that's the first point I want to make on this, is that culture makes creative businesses sometimes harder to export. Okay, you have less issues with fashion, you have less issues maybe with music, but still it's part of it. There are ways that what makes a piece of creative work exciting is also linked to the specificity of the culture, and we have seen that it's possible with Afrobeats, but also like big hits like Jerusalem around the world. Everybody's just, I was just walking in the street last night in Lisbon. There's a popular holiday going on right now, and there's still Jerusalem is playing in all the streets. I mean, you know, it's crazy. Nobody knows what the music is about, nobody knows what the lyrics say, but everybody loves that song. So there are ways that it can translate, but it is a challenge. The second thing that I would say on how culture relates to the creative industries is that it's well known. Again, I'm looking at the private sector and trying to drive private investment in the sector. If you look at African creative entrepreneurs trying to raise funds from traditional investors, there's a bit of a cultural a difference here in terms of how both people at the table speak about their business, speak about what they do, or even just cultural. You know, you may be a young woman from Zimbabwe trying to pitch your project, and you're faced with, you know, a 50-year-old Dutch man who's in a foundation or a VC firm, and you couldn't be more different culturally, but you're going to have to find a common language to work with each other. If you're the entrepreneur here, you're going to have to try to convince the investor that what you're doing is you know, a good investment. So that also is something that's tricky. That is why I think that you know, paying attention to this and getting creative entrepreneurs to learn the language of the investment community is something that needs to happen. I mean, Natasha, you made me laugh when you said that Africa is an overtrained continent. I see completely what you mean. I've raised money from public sources before, and the key to raising this kind of fund is to say that you're going to do training, and that gets everybody excited, and they give you money for some reason. And yet, yes, there's no money then for people to start businesses, or there are no jobs. So that's very, very true. That is also because of a cultural misunderstanding, right? And we need to shift this conversation towards, okay, fine, we can train people, but honestly, let's just trade. Let's just have them create proper businesses and proper initiatives, and then that's where the money needs to go. So yes, that's what I would say from my point of view on this topic.
Well, thank you, Marie, and thank you for that overarching foundational reminder to think global and act local, but also the additional that there's that opportunity also to challenge ourselves to think global as well. Ojoma, you can take it really quickly.
Sure. So from my perspective, I think there's a bunch of things. To the point about culture being closely associated with the creative economy, I think you cannot separate culture from the creative economy. And I think if you work back from funding, what do people fund? They fund good products with a good business model that will make money or make impact, right? And so in terms of the quality of the product, I think you cannot divorce the quality of the product from how rich or how culturally rich the origin of that product is, in my view, certainly not for the creative industries. Another thing is creative economy products thrive on authenticity and uniqueness, right? And that authenticity and uniqueness comes from the cultural heritage and the context that those products are coming from. So I think for me, there's a positive correlation between culture and the creative economy. Nollywood, if you took it as a case study, it's not, in my view, it works because Nollywood is not pretending to be anything but what it is, right? It's a product that comes from the cultural context of where those films are from. And that's why it's so powerful. It tells its own stories in its own way. So I think that's the first point I want to make. I think for me, where the mismatch between, where the cultural context then has an impact on funding of the creative economy is, at the end of the day, creative and cultural products have dual value. There's the intrinsic value of our music, our fashion, our visual art are an expression of who we are, right? And we're not doing it because we want to make money. That's just who we are. And so I think there's a mismatch between us knowing when a cultural product is just an intrinsic expression versus us knowing when a cultural product is a product that can be monetized. They're not the same thing. Not all culture is a creative economy product. Neither should it be. Sometimes we just sing because that's the expression of a ritual or a tradition or something. And I think that translates into the funding landscape, in that both investors and the creative economy, I don't think, can distinguish between what culture is intrinsically and what culture is as a cultural product that then has a whole different dynamic to translating into something that can be bought and sold and monetized. And I think that's where the language mismatch between investors and investees often comes in. But also that's where the lack of understanding on both sides comes in. Because when investors often are thinking about cultural goods and services, I don't think they can divorce in their minds that thing that we just do as a hobby or that thing that we just do, because I don't feel like they can distinguish between that and this cultural product, which is a function of that intrinsic value, but it's a different thing because it has been created for the primary purpose of achieving economic value. But I think also as creatives, we also make that mistake of trying to sell the intrinsic value of something for somebody that's looking for pounds and dollars and naira value from that thing. So I think that culture of that rich heritage sometimes holds us back from seeing the distinction between cultural products as that intrinsic thing that we do because, and this thing that's the raw material for what can be a really thriving economic sector. And I think we need to start distinguishing between those two things.
If I can jump in quickly, sorry, I don't want to take more time, but I think you nailed it, Ojoma, and actually thank you for putting it so clearly, because then that gives us ways to move forward. This is really what's happening. And I think that may be, you should write an article about it, or should do a workshop just about that. But yes, and also it's indeed not a bad thing. Like the two things can live side by side. If you are an artist and you're just interested in expressing, as you said, the intrinsic value of your culture, there are ways that you can do that. It's mostly going to be grants. It's a certain lifestyle you're going to choose. Don't think of yourself necessarily as an entrepreneur. You're an artist. You may get commissioned to do a public work. You may have a few patrons liking what you do, but that's where it stops. And then it's also okay to be somebody who is creative, who is tapping into the richness of the culture, but to create a product that could be a fashion brand, could be an accessories brand, that can be a music label, and both are okay, but you have to kind of realize who you are and which side you want to play. I have to say that the few people who know how to make that differences, usually they are the people who are at the top of it. So a film studio, for example, in Nigeria, typically the filmmakers who have a thriving practice, they've been able to kind of identify that sweet spot, or the people who are at the top of music labels, and now we have lots of strong music labels across Africa. That's exactly the job that they do. They will find an artist that is young and upcoming, that is just raw, and they will shape and package them into a product. So there's few people who know how to do that in Africa. Usually these people are successful. They need to be empowered as well, because then they can help bring the whole industry up. So yes, these people are rare, and we should find them and support them, so that then they can help create networks around them. Yeah.
Thank you all for those great contributions. And Marie, back at you. As both a founder and entrepreneur in the creative economy with experience spanning many years, as an investor, curious as to whether you have invested in any creative business startups. If yes, can you tell us about the experience and shed light on the intricacies of investing in a creative business, and whether it differs from investing in a non-creative business? If not, please let us know whether this is by design or circumstance.
Yes, of course. I'm very invested in the creative sector. So first of all, I started my own companies in the creative sector. So that's a way of investment on myself, right? So I actually started in Kenya. I co-created the XYZ show with Gado and set up the production studios Buni Media. So that's an investment that I made, in actual products and actual companies. It's still going as a team. There's a company that works. As a founder, I founded one of the first VOD, so video on demand on the continent, that was Buni TV in 2012. I was extremely early in the tech space. This company I exited when it was acquired by the Trace Group. So these are, I would say, the first investments that I made. It was investments as a founder, so investment on my time and energy. I learned a lot from these. Then through the advisory practice, I advise others on how to invest. I've made my own angel investments, not all of them in the creative sector, but some, because I also like to invest in what I called enablers. So for creatives to be able to thrive, you do need to have some edtech ways for them to improve their skills. So these are also areas that I look at. And now going forward, I have kind of refined my investments, and I'm looking more specifically for startups that are at the intersection of creativity and tech. And why? Because through all these experiences that I've had, I now know which sectors are good for a lifestyle business. So you can grow a business that's sustainable and sustains you and a small team for a long time. So that would be a production company, for example. And I now know which businesses have the potential to scale and become really large companies, Pan-African companies, global companies. And so if I look at it as an investor, I'm interested in the companies that have the potential to really scale. And so that leads me to creativity and tech. I mentioned before what has happened in terms of trends in the past couple of years. And so I'm really interested in the growth in what we now call the creator economy. So basically, this could concern any kind of creative activity, but really targeting sales of any kind of products. Some people put the influencers monetizing their audiences in there, but it can be marketplaces of physical or digital products. It can be creator tools. So for example, tools that help creatives publish their work or track the data. I'm also interested very much in Web3 and what Web3 is bringing in terms of new businesses in Africa. So if some people listening to us here are not completely familiar with Web3, but it's basically a new technology that is right now we're in the era of Web 2. So Web 1 was when the internet was created. The idea behind the internet was let's all connect with no intermediaries online and share information. Web 3, it has been really the structuration of this around big global companies such as Google, Facebook, or even Spotify that actually will own the data from the people who put content on their platform. So for you as an individual, if you're posting a photo on Facebook, or as a creative, you're putting your money on Spotify, you don't actually own the data from your audience. And that's really the area we're in Web 2. What Web3 is doing now, which is starting now, we're in the early age of this, is through this technology called blockchain. It enables you as a person, but as a creative as well, to log in whatever you produce or whatever you do online in a universal ledger that for everybody. This person is the person that owns this and that created this. So that enables ownership. I'm not going to go into too much technical details, but basically it's really a revolution for the creative sector, not just in Africa and the world, where you can now not be disassociated from the thing that you have created. It will always be linked to you. This means you can do whatever you want with it. You can sell part of your creation and raise money on your own. You can benefit from secondary sales. Let's say, the first person buys your song, 5 later it sells to somebody else, you will get the revenue from that. So it opens lots and lots of new business models. And I'm also interested in gaming, and especially because now you have business models that enable play to earn, which means that young people who have skills can go and play a variety of games and receive tokens or even cash for that. And in an economy where we have a lot of youth unemployment, but a lot of smart and skilled people, you can see how that can be very popular in Africa and can lead also to new businesses. So as an entrepreneur, I'm now looking at these type of high growth areas. And how is it different to invest in the creative industries and other industries? I don't actually think it's different. What's different is that traditional investors do not understand the creative sector, so they get scared. But if you are from the creative sector like I am and understand what works and what doesn't, it's very similar. You look at the same big things. You look at who the founder is, you look at the markets that they're addressing, you look at their product, their solution, and you look at the opportunities for scaling. So it is not that maybe what is harder is to determine a bit of the secret sauce. Like when you meet the founder with creative, does that person have what it takes in terms of sensitivity, in terms of storytelling, to do what it is that they're trying to do, whether it is fashion or a game or a piece of music. So traditional investors would not know how to distinguish a good versus a bad creator. But if that's the word you operate in, it's pretty clear. Just like you can see if somebody's a good or bad business person or good or bad engineer.
Thank you, Marie. Thank you very much for that. And now we'll just move on to the final set of questions, which will be directed at the panel. And then thereafter, we will open the floor for the question and answer session. So the first question is, strategic partnerships are crucial for growth of sectors, and the creative economy is not excluded from this fact. Due to the personal nature that tends to go hand in hand with creative ventures, partnerships are oftentimes not widely embraced. How can sector players in the creative economy benefit from partnerships and at the same time retain the freedom to create? I'll ask Ojoma, then Natasha.
Okay, so first of all, I think that question makes an assumption that all the businesses in the creative economy are creative. They are not. But I think that's also something that we struggle with. The creative economy is an ecosystem. At the heart of the ecosystem is creativity, but there's a whole other range of things. So if you take film, for example, at the heart is the film, but you have the distribution technology, you have the payments technology if you're streaming online, you have the infrastructure like cinemas and so on. You have all of these sort of ancillary services, marketing, and so on and so forth. In all of these aspects of the ecosystem, there are businesses and there are companies. So I think fundamentally for me, that's also something we need to be shifting away from. And we battle this all of the time in the creative economy practice when we assume that everybody in the creative economy is creative. I would say that in fact, creatives are probably in the minority, right? Because, or should be, because for every one creative product, there's a whole range of other skills that need to be able to take that creative product to market. And so we need to start moving towards what are those ecosystem capabilities that we need. And I think the creative economy practice is a case in point. I have no claim to creativity or artistic talent, but I'm running a company that's inside of the creative economy. And so are many people potentially on the call. And to that point, I think at the end of the day, partnerships are driven by mutual value. So the creative economy practice at CcHUB is an example of where, as an individual, I've been an arts manager, I've been a creative economy consultant, I've worked for various organizations, and I've decided, right, I want to start a company. Should I start from scratch or should I go into partnership? And I've gone into partnership with CcHUB to create this creative economy practice. Fundamentally, we're trying to achieve the same thing, which is we want to see more value creation from the creative economy, and we're bringing different strengths into the partnership. So I suppose my answer to that is I would challenge the idea that businesses in the creative economy are a personal thing or a deeply personal thing, unless we're talking about the sort of core creative product. But even then, still sticking with the example of film, you have the script writer, you have the director, you have a whole range of creative disciplines that bring the script to life. So while the script is deeply personal, and it's back to that thing I was saying, are you trying to create an intrinsic cultural product? Are you trying to create a product that sells? Sometimes they're the same thing. Often you have to sort of give and take to get to that point where you create something that sells. So it's down to the motivation of the individual and seeing the sort of greater value that partnership will bring. But that's my sort of angle to that question.
Thank you. For the sake of time, we'll move to the next panel question, which will be addressed by both Natasha and Marie. And that will be, creative products, especially in Africa, are not largely exported. Strands such as music and film are less so because of social media. But even when they end up in specific regions and not others, how can stakeholders make the creative economy more exportable and the benefits that this would bring to the creative economy? Maybe Marie, you can start, and then Natasha will finish it off.
I think, again, it goes back to Ojoma's point, which I guess the key learning from the session. But yes, is the product really a product? Or is it just something that someone has wanted to create because they like it? And again, not the same thing. But so I believe that the creative products of African creatives would be a lot more exportable if they were thought of as actual products. And so that probably means that the original creative, if it's not in them directly, they should team up with a marketing person, with a salesperson, and all of that if they don't have these skills, and they should really look at what's out there. I'm giving you an example. I'm looking at currently potential investment, which I love because it's a B2B platform that actually aims to take made in Africa products. So all sorts of products, could be cosmetic, be fashion, could be tea, and make them exportable into big retail businesses in the US. So not Walmart. Walmart is a little low end, but Nordstrom or these kind of places. And so this entrepreneur is trying to do that. She's very experienced. She has connections on both sides, and she's looking for a few brands to start with. And what she's finding is that there are some great products in Africa, but they are not packaged for global export in many ways. For example, they don't have the right branding. There's certain codes internationally that make a product attractive. It's the same for every country. You can keep some, cultural specificity, but the packages have to look modern and exciting. So in general, the products are not packaged properly. The storytelling around the product has not been workshopped and done properly, the whole marketing. And the products are not made for export in terms of you need to go through a lot of approvals. There's lots of standards to export to various countries. You have to go through the whole process, get licenses, authorizations, all sorts of stuff. You need to be able to produce a certain amount to ship, otherwise it makes no sense. So there's lots of steps. So this particular entrepreneur has made it her mission to go find these brands and help do all of that they're not doing, to bring them to a level where they're exportable, and then she'll help find distribution networks in the developed markets for these products. And I think that is great, and that's what is missing at the moment. So this is super hard, right? Because very often people who have their own little brand, own creative products, they're not even aware of the global standards. They're isolated and they have all sorts of logistical nightmare issues to deal with. And of course, no support from no government or anything. So I'm not saying it's an easy thing, but this is at the heart of the problem, because we all know you go anywhere in Africa, in any city, you'll find a wonderful little product, wonderful little brand. No one else knows about them, and they just get stuck in their own tiny corner. And we need the people who know how to spot them and to brand them and to market them and to distribute them. So these are jobs that are hyper valuable. The people who have these skills, if they partner with the creatives, now we have a real business. Now you're going to be able to attract investors. Now you're going to be able to make sales. So let's really look at this missing part of the value chain. I want to give another example for those of you in the fashion world here. It's Birimian Venture, which is an investment fund started by Lorraine Kwesi Olsen, who is Ivorian. She's focusing on African luxury fashion brands. She invests in them. She's picked a few, but she doesn't just give money. She helps them exactly what Brennan prepared for export, and then she is placing these brands into big distribution networks in France, in Paris, with top level stores and retailers, and she has all the right connections, and she's doing all of that. These initiatives are what are really bringing African brands to the rest of the world. I see these initiatives popping up around. So I think that that's what's missing to really encourage the export of African creative products.
Well, thank you, Marie. Natasha, do you want to take it real quick?
Yeah, I have two things. I would like to first give comment to what Ojoma said. I think especially for funders, the one thing I would like to encourage funders and investors is first to listen to the ecosystem and community. There's an assumption, and a condescending one of that is that we know what's best for African creatives. And why don't we take a minute to listen to their needs, because they are quite clear about what they want and where they want to go. So instead of thinking we know what to fund and how to go, take time and sit with creatives, figure out what they want, what they're struggling with, and then engage in that space and help them move to the next level. Moving to what you raised, Naomi, I want to be a bit controversial, and apologies in advance, Marie. I don't think the challenge sometimes is actually the packaging and leveling it up to international standards. I think there are two things here. One, when we look at, for example, Afrobeats and etc., and even Amapiano, sometimes those videos are recorded in someone's backyard. And I think we need to just first focus on the market within the continent first. We have the youngest population globally. We have young people craving for African content. Why don't we find a way to reach them in a way that matters? For example, when young people are buying content or streaming online, and I'll give an example of Spotify, young Kenyans are not using the Visa cards to pay for Spotify. They're using M-Pesa, mobile banking. So it's just finding ways to tailor your approach to suit that particular country, that particular context. That's the first step. The second step is to realize that there are other ways that African content has been, and creativity, there's been a lot of gatekeeping internationally. And when we say sometimes set some international standards, that sometimes may mean actually killing the very essence of that creativity and innovation and shaping it to look in a particular westernized way that moves away from the particular essence of that project. So it's also my challenge to funders and people in the international space. How can you create space for African creatives to thrive in the international context as well, realizing that there's a trajectory of growth needed? Are we also going to give African creatives room to fail, room to create work that sometimes is mediocre? And again, I bring back the example of when you look at some rom-coms that you've watched. They are horrible. You would never watch them again. But again, there are certain people who are given creativity and space to create horrible art. And for Africans, we sort of have such a high standard that if it's not meeting this particular standard, then you can't pass the hoops of success. And I think that's very unfair. Excellence sometimes is learned, and it's learned by doing, failing, and challenging ourselves. So for me, I think we are doing great. We just need the space. We need the money to be able to release and put our work out there. Oftentimes when I'm meeting with creatives and people in the media space, I'm always asking, what do you need? They're like, Natasha, you know what we need. We need funding, we need opportunities, we need partnerships. And partnerships don't even need to be financial. They can be in a way that you're ensuring that you're helping them get to the next level. You're connecting them with people who will help them unlock the art and the sophistication needed for them to appeal to the international markets. So for me, I want us to think globally and holistically when it comes to partnerships and when it comes to standards. What do we mean by standards? Because for all intents and purposes, and I'll give an example of Burna Boy. I'm yet to meet someone who works as hard as he does. Just before you sleep, you wake up, you realize Burna Boy is releasing a new album. Gosh, so you are wondering, when does this guy rest? And that particular level of excellence may not necessarily be required of an international act. So once again, I ask ourselves to think outside the box. What can we do to create that enabling environment for creatives to thrive without expecting them to be world-class 24/7? That's it from me.
If I can just jump in, I know we need to move to Q&A.
Okay, jump into.
All right.
Go ahead,
Okay, I'll let you do it, Marie. I know we have to.
I'll try to be super quick. You make some very good points, Natasha, but just on a few things. Yes, of course, this is the local market, but having been an entrepreneur myself on actually the Kenyan market, unfortunately, the real truth is there are very little people ready or who have the means to pay for creative products at a price that it is worth. That is just the reality of the market now. I try to do video on demand. I try to do lots of other things. Very few people pay for it. But everybody integrates M-Pesa and all the mobile money now. It's not that problem anymore. But very, very few people pay. And unfortunately, my own journey as an entrepreneur, even as a consultant, I've had to realize if I want to make a decent living being in the creative space in Africa, I need to make the people with money pay, which means that for me, I'm taking my money from international people to then drive and try to drive investment in African creatives. That's how it works for me as an individual. And unfortunately, I think this is the current opportunity for a lot of people now is you have to target the people who can pay for what you're creating. That is the reality. Doesn't mean we're not building the ecosystem. We're doing that, but it might take 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, right? In the meantime, we all need to eat. So that's the first thing. And just to specify in terms of international export standards, I'm talking of very basic stuff such as labels that says what's in the product. That's what the standards are. It is true that there's some gatekeeping. It's true that there are some rules that are unfair when it comes to African exports. Very true. The startup I was talking about is actually lobbying actively the US government, she's a Senegalese woman, to loosen some of these standards so that African brands can be exported in the US. So that is true. You're facing an uphill battle, but that's what I talk when I talk about standards. I talk about practical things in terms of having the label, having the ingredients, having the right packaging that goes through customs. All the stuff are just things to think about. That was it. You can go, Ojoma.
Yeah, the only quick thing I was going to add is that
I want to come back.
Unfortunately, I think we do have to move on to questions because I know there's people's hands up. It will be unfair to not give them a chance. But I think there are different types of money. And that's something I think that in the creative economy, we need to understand. There's money that allows you to experiment and try new things. There's money that wants a guaranteed return. They are not the same thing. And so I think we need to deeply understand the philosophy of money if we're going to succeed at getting finance and investment. So I just wanted to drop that in. Maybe that's another creative business series topic, the different types of money. But I know we have to move on. Natasha, I don't want to take over from Naomi, but maybe a quick minute. I see there's lots of hands up.
No, this one I'll take offline. I'll take offline with Marie. I'll take offline.
Okay, thank you all. We shall move on to the question and answer session. Labake, can you start unmuting the participants to ask their questions kindly?
I think Wafa had her hand up first.
Hello, my name is Adiola Adisle from Lagos. It's very interesting conversation. My question is that, you know, in the African market, really, I just want to know what are actually the success stories, you know, for most of these problems that I've been talking about. Are there people that have been able to, you know, scale above most of these problems? And what kind of bottlenecks or what kind of problems do you think that, or the one main problem, because people say it's funding, but is it really funding, or is it really that, you know, we don't just have the human capital yet to do this thing?
Do you want me to take that question? So I think simple, from my experience, I used to work for the British Council. There's a UNESCO International Fund for Cultural Diversity. I sat on the selection committee for that. So I've sat on the investor side and in the creative economy practice. I've seen a lot of companies, lots that, you know, are going nowhere fast, lots that have succeeded. And I think for me, the ingredients that I see are, one, they understand the business of what they're trying to do, which is a totally different thing from being creative or being artistic. And I can't stress this enough. You want to make a film, you need to decide, are you making a film because you are expressing a passion, or are you making a film that you want to sell? Sometimes those two things meet, but if you're trying to sell a product, there's a different type of thinking that's required. And to my mind, the entrepreneurs that I see that succeed, of which there are many, whether you're looking in film, in visual arts, in music, I don't need to start naming names, but there's several companies. And I'm not just talking about stars that you're seeing on television. I'm talking about publishing companies. I'm talking about logistics companies that are focused on creative products. I'm talking about e-commerce. I'm talking about platforms that succeed. They raise money. One of our portfolio companies in CcHUB is a company called Taillo. It's Taillo. So they're a furniture and lifestyle company. They started in something like 2019. They're raising at the moment a $4.5 million raise for their Series A. It's a successful company run by a young African making African products. So it can be done. And I think in my perspective, the difference is they understand they're building a business. They understand what the structuring of building a business is, and they act accordingly, which is not always the same time as just being a creative. But I wonder if Marie and Natasha have anything to...
No, I mean, I really agree with what you're saying on this topic. There's been a lot of success. Then it depends, you know, how big we're talking about. Africa has not yet produced a company that would be the equivalent in the creative industries of Jumia in retail, or you know, Paystack or Flutterwave or Andela in tech. But I think it's going to come in the next wave, and you know, it's coming. But there's a lot of creative entrepreneurs that just make a good living in Africa in that way. But again, that's the thing, you have to understand the business. For me also, I get a lot of pitches, and it's true, most people don't understand fully the space they're in. So it's like any other business, you have to understand who's going to buy your product at what price, you know, how big your market really is. It goes down to business fundamentals. This is a type we're talking of, again, Natasha, overtraining. This is a type of training actually that's not there enough. There's a few pockets of people trying to train entrepreneurs. So CcHUB is one. In Francophone Africa, you have Alliance ICC. In East Africa, you have Heva Fund. You know, I try to do this for the companies I mentor. You have a few programs here and there. But I think that that's really something that's missing, is just so that entrepreneurs in this sector understand just the business side of it. But you can, if you're a self-starter, all the answers are on our friend Google and our friend YouTube. So you can start with doing your own research, and lots of stuff is out there already.
Nothing more to add. I agree with you both.
Thank you. Famous hand is up. Omolabake, would you like to go ahead and unmute Famous so that he can ask his question? As we wait for Famous's question, there is a question from Ofa. How can we overcome access to information regarding resources and building capacities in R&M for the CCI?
So the question is, how can we overcome access to information regarding resources and capacity and resource mobilization for the CCI? I can hazard a guess. I think one of the issues in many emerging economies is information asymmetry, which is people, just a mismatch between who has information and who needs to know that information, whether it's information regarding supply chains or information regarding opportunities or funding. Information asymmetry is not a unique problem to the CCI. So let's start there. It's a characteristic of many sectors in many emerging economies. And often the solution is in building the platforms and the networks that allow information to be shared. So clusters, hubs are different mechanisms that have been established in different sectors and different geographies to try and bridge those information gaps. The internet obviously is creating an additional model. At the end of the day, to the point earlier about there are different types of businesses and organizations in the creative sector, we need more businesses and organizations that are tackling information asymmetry in the creative economies. Governments cannot do it. They can try, they can contribute to the solution, but until we have that aspect of the ecosystem solved through sustainable businesses or NGOs or sector support organizations, then we're always going to have that problem. It's a bit of a general answer, but I think we just need the ecosystem for that to be developed.
Yeah, just quickly, I'm trying to do my best to plug some of this gap. So I post regularly on LinkedIn on all of these issues. So please follow me on LinkedIn at my full name. I also have a newsletter called Hustle and Flow that's on business and investment in the entertainment sports sector. I must admit that I haven't published a new one in the past 6 months because I'm working on something new, but all the archives are publicly online and there's a lot of information, and not just news. I do analysis of a whole lot of things. So if you go back in the archive, you will learn basically, I'll take a news and I'll say what it means. So I would recommend you to read that. But the way that I find my own information, so first of all, of course, through my work being in the space, through the advisory work I do, but I am on the internet all the time, following all sorts of people, reading everything, reading all the articles I find, obscure stuff, all from African sources, all, of course, internationals, but who work in Africa. You just, and I have a background as a journalist, for me it comes naturally, but really too often I find entrepreneurs coming to me and they have gaps that honestly a simple Google search, they would have found their answer. So just learn how to research on your own. There's lots and lots of stuff online, and there's lots of workshops now, and there's lots of hubs. So if you have a question, just really dig into the internet as a first step.
I think just to add on to that is be curious. Also, first and foremost, if you're all here, subscribe to the African of Filter community page. We are very regularly sharing the work around our ecosystem. And the only way we can bridge this information gap is through ecosystem building and community building. Do not ride solo. Plug into the communities around you, plug into the hubs around you. Google, as Marie has said, find ways to learn more about the communities within your space. Reach out. Cold emails actually work. I actually respond to people who cold email me because I'm like, it's bold of you. It's taking some courage. I may not be able to give you what you need, but I could connect you to another particular space. So the world favors the self-promoters. Share your work on different platforms, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. Find different ways for your work to get out there, but also connect and engage with people who are already doing the work. So I think plug into Africa No Filter and the other spaces that are existing, but most importantly, connect yourself to ecosystems.
Okay, thank you for that. We have a question from Olabode Moses. Where does social entrepreneurship fit in the creative economy space? Ojoma?
So I think, yeah, we've come full circle. At the top of the call, I was saying people make investments for profit, or they make investments for impact. Social entrepreneurship is obviously entrepreneurship to do good and make money. And so it fits insofar as if you're doing good using a creative discipline, either using art for social change or using the arts to for inclusion, or whatever social cause you're using your art for, is definitely relevant. I think the thing you need to be clear on is, back to also what I was saying, there are different types of money. Some money is looking for profit only. Some money is looking for impact only. Some money is looking for profit and impact. If you're a social entrepreneur, the sweet spot for you is money that's looking for both impact and profit. And so that's where you should be sort of channeling, but there's certainly a place for social enterprise in the creative economy.
Okay, as we wait for the question in the chat, we just want to thank you for partaking in this discussion, and maybe just some very key takeaways from the main discussion. Africa's creative economy needs more funding than it needs capacity building. There's a difference between a cultural expression and a creative output that has a cultural roots. A clear distinction of this will be beneficial to funding opportunities of the creative economy. And finally, government policy should not be used to gatekeep or regulate creatives, but to make it easier for them to thrive. We will be hosting this creative business series every quarter. Please join our community so that you get updates on when this creative business series will be hosted next, amongst all other activities within the creative economy. We also request that you fill out the African Cities Cultural Vibrancy Index, the survey, which will be our primary data collection tool in creating the index. Thank you so much for your participation. You are more than welcome to send your questions to info@CcHUB Creative Economy.Africa. Thank you.